The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. Chapter 23. One festival day, soon after our landing at Troy, Achilles rose at dawn. "Where are you going?" I asked him. "My mother," he said, then slipped through the tent flap before I could speak again. His mother. Some part of me had hoped, foolishly, that she would not follow us here, that her grief would keep her away, or the distance. But of course they did not. The shore of Anatolia was no more inconvenient than the shore of Greece, and her grief only made her visits longer. He would leave at dawn, and the sun would be nearly at its peak before he would return. I would wait, pacing and unsettled. What could she possibly have to say to him for so long? Some divine disaster, I feared. Some celestial dictate that would take him from me. Briseis came often to wait with me. "Do you want to walk up to the woods?" she would say. Just the low sweetness of her voice, the fact that she wished to comfort me, helped take me out of myself, and a trip with her to the woods always soothed me. She seemed to know all of its secrets, just as Chiron had, where the mushrooms hid and the rabbits had their burrows. She had even begun to teach me the native names of the plants and trees. When we were finished, we would sit on the ridge, looking over the camp, so I could watch for his return. On this day, she had picked a small basket of coriander. The fresh green leaf smell was all around us. "I'm sure he'll be back soon," she said. Her words were like new leather, still stiff and precise, yet not run together with use. When I did not answer, she said, "Where does he stay so long?" Why shouldn't she know? It wasn't a secret. "His mother is a goddess," I said. "A sea nymph. He goes to see her." I'd expected her to be startled or frightened, but she only nodded. "I thought that he was something. He does not—" She paused. "He does not move like a human." I smiled then. "And what does a human move like?" "Like you," she said. "Clumsy, then." She did not know the word. I demonstrated, thinking to make her laugh, but she shook her head vehemently. "No, you are not like that. That is not what I meant." I never heard what she meant, for at that moment Achilles crested the hill. "I thought I'd find you here," he said. Briseis excused herself and returned to her tent. Achilles threw himself down on the ground, hand behind his head. "I'm starving," he said. "Here." I gave him the rest of the cheese we had brought for lunch. He ate it gratefully. "What did you talk about with your mother?" I was almost nervous to ask. Those hours with her were not forbidden to me, but they were always separate. His breath blew out, not quite a sigh. "She's worried about me," he said. "Why?" I bristled at the thought of her fretting over him. That was mine to do. "She says that there's strangeness among the gods, that they are fighting with each other, taking sides in the war. She fears that the gods have promised me fame, but not how much." This was a new worry I had not considered. But of course, our stories had many characters, great Perseus or modest Peleus, Heracles or almost forgotten Hylas. Some had a whole epic, others just a verse. He sat up, wrapping his arms around his knees. "I think she is afraid that someone else is going to kill Hector, before me." Another new fear. Achilles' life suddenly cut shorter than it already was. "Who does she mean?" "I don't know. Ajax has tried and failed, Diomedes too. They're the best after me. There's no one else I can think of." "What about Menelaus?" Achilles shook his head. "Never. He is brave and strong, but that is all. He would break against Hector like water on a rock. So it is me or no one." "You will not do it." I tried not to let it sound like begging. "No." He was quiet a moment. "But I can see it. That's the strange thing. Like in a dream, I can see myself throwing the spear, see him fall. I walk up to the body and stand over it." Dread rose in my chest. I took a breath, forced it away. "And then what?" That's the strangest of all. I look down at his blood and I know my death is coming, but in the dream I do not mind. What I feel most of all is relief. Do you think it can be prophecy? The question seemed to make him self-conscious. He shook his head. No, I think it is nothing at all. A daydream. I forced my voice to match his in lightness. I'm sure you're right. After all, Hector hasn't done anything to you. He smiled then, as I had hoped he would. Yes, he said. I've heard that. During the long hours of Achilles' absence, I began to stray from our camp, seeking company, something to occupy myself. Thetis' news had disturbed me. Quarrels among the gods, Achilles' mighty fame endangered. I did not know what to make of it, and my questions chased themselves around my head until I was half crazy. I needed a distraction, something sensible and real. One of the men pointed me towards the white physician's tent. If you're looking for something to do, they always need help, he said. I remembered Chiron's patient hands. The instruments hung on rose quartz walls. I went. The tent's interior was dim, the air dark and sweet and musky, heavy with the metallic scent of blood. In one corner was the physician, Machaon, bearded, square-jawed, pragmatically bare-chested, an old tunic tied carelessly around his waist. He was darker than most Greeks, despite the time he spent inside, and his hair was cropped short, practical again, to keep it from his eyes. He bent now over a wounded man's leg, gently probing an embedded arrow point. On the other side of the tent, his brother, Podalirius, finished strapping on his armor. He tossed an offhand word to Machaon before shouldering past me out the door. It was well known that he preferred the battlefield to the surgeon's tent, though he served in both. Machaon did not look up as he spoke. You can't be very wounded if you can stand for so long. No, I said. I'm here. I paused as the arrowhead came free in Machaon's fingers, and the soldier groaned in relief. Well? His voice was businesslike, but not unkind. Do you need help? He made a noise I guessed was assent. Sit down and hold the salves for me, he said, without looking. I obeyed, gathering up the small bottles strewn on the floor, some rattling with herbs, some heavy with ointment. I sniffed them and remembered. Garlic and honey salve against infection, poppy for sedation, and yarrow to make the blood clot. Dozens of herbs that brought the centaur's patient fingers back to me, the sweet garden smell of the rose-colored cave. I held out the ones he needed and watched his deft application, a pinch of sedative on the man's upper lip for him to nose and nibble at, a swipe of salve to ward off infection, then dressings to pack and bind and cover. Machaon smoothed the last layer of creamy, scented beeswax over the man's leg and looked up wearily. Patroclus, yes? And you studied with Chiron? You are welcome here. A clamor outside the tent, raised voices and cries of pain. He nodded towards it. They've brought us another. You take him. The soldiers, Nestor's men, hoisted their comrade onto the empty pallet in the tent's corner. He had been shot with an arrow, barbed at the tip, through the right shoulder. His face was foamy with sweat scum, and he'd bitten his lip almost in half, trying not to scream. His breath came out now in muffled, explosive pants, and his panicked eyes rolled and trembled. I resisted the urge to call for Machaon, busy with another man who had started to wail, and reached for a cloth to wipe his face. The arrow had pierced through the thickest part of his shoulder and was threaded half in and half out, like a terrible needle. I would have to break off the fletching and put the end through him, without further tearing the flesh or leaving splinters that might fester. Quickly, I gave him the draught that Chiron had taught me, a mix of poppy and willow bark that made the patient light-headed and blunted to pain. He could not hold the cup, so I held it for him, lifting and cradling his head so he would not choke, feeling his sweat and foam and blood seep into my tunic. I tried to look reassuring, tried not to show the panic I was feeling. He was, I saw, only a year or so older than I, one of Nestor's sons, Antilochus, a sweet-faced young man who doted on his father. It will be all right, I said, over and over, to myself, or him. I didn't know. The problem was the arrow shaft. Normally, a doctor would snap off one end, pulling it through, but there was not enough of it sticking out of his chest to do it without tearing the flesh further. I could not leave it, nor drag the fletching through the wound. What then? Behind me, one of the soldiers who had brought him stood fidgeting in the doorway. I gestured to him over my shoulder. "A knife, quickly, sharp as you can find it." I surprised myself with the brisk authority in my voice, the instant obedience it provoked. He returned with a short, finely honed blade made for cutting meat, still rusty with dried blood. He cleaned it on his tunic before handing it to me. The boy's face was slack now, his tongue flopping loose in his mouth. I leaned over him and held the arrow shaft, crushing the fletching into my damp palm. With my other hand I began sawing, cutting through the wood, a flake at a time, as lightly as possible, so as not to jar the boy's shoulder. He snuffed and muttered, lost in the fog of the drop. I sawed and braced and sawed. My back ached, and I berated myself for leaving his head on my knees, for not choosing better positioning. Finally, the feathered end snapped off, leaving only one long splinter that the knife quickly cut through. At last. Then, just as difficult, to draw the shaft out the other side of his shoulder. In a moment of inspiration, I grabbed a salve for infection and carefully coated the wood, hoping it would ease the journey and ward off corruption. Then, a little at a time, I began to work the arrow through. After what felt like hours, the splintered end emerged, soaked with blood. With the last of my wits, I wrapped and packed the wound, binding it in a sort of sling across his chest. Later, Patroclus would tell me that I was insane to have done what I did, to have cut so slowly, at such an angle. A good wrench, he said, and the end would have broken. Jarred wound and splinters inside be damned, there were other men who needed tending. But Machion saw how well the shoulder healed, with no infection and little pain, and the next time there was an arrow wound, he called me over and passed me a sharp blade, looking at me expectantly. It was a strange time. Over us every second hung the terror of Achilles' destiny, while the murmurs of war among the gods grew louder. But even I could not fill each minute with fear. I have heard that men who live by a waterfall cease to hear it. In such a way did I learn to live beside the rushing torrent of his doom. The days passed and he lived. The months passed. I could go a whole day without looking over the precipice of his death. The miracle of a year. Then too. The others seemed to feel a similar softening. Our camp began to form a sort of family, drawn together around the flames of the dinner fire. When the moon rose and the stars pricked through the sky's darkness, we would all find our way there, Achilles and I and old Phoenix, and then the women, originally only Briseis, but now a small clump of bobbing faces, reassured by the welcome she had received. And still one more, Automedon, the youngest of us, just 17. He was a quiet young man, and Achilles and I had watched his strength and deftness grow, as he learned to drive Achilles' difficult horses, to wheel around the battlefield with the necessary flourish. It was a pleasure for Achilles and me to host our own hearth, playing the adults we did not quite feel like, as we passed the meat and poured the wine. As the fire died down, we would wipe the juice of the meal from our faces and clamor for stories from Phoenix. He would lean forward in his chair to oblige. The firelight made the bones of his face look significant. Delphic, something that augurs might try to read. Briseis told stories too, strange and dreamlike, tales of enchantment, of gods spellbound by magic and mortals who blundered upon them unawares. The gods were strange, half men and half animal, ruled deities, not the high gods that the city worshipped. They were beautiful, these tales, told in her low sing-song voice. Sometimes they were funny too, her imitations of a cyclops or the snuffling of a lion seeking out a hidden man. Later, when we were alone, Achilles would repeat little snatches of them, lifting his voice, playing a few notes on the lyre. It was easy to see how such lovely things might become songs, and I was pleased because I felt that he had seen her, had understood why I spent my days with her when he was gone. She was one of us now, I thought, a member of our circle, for life. It was on one of these nights that Achilles asked her what she knew of Hector. She had been leaning back on her hands, the inner flush of her elbows warmed by the fire, but at his voice she startled a little and sat up. He did not speak directly to her often, nor she to him, a remnant perhaps of what had happened in our village. "I do not know much," she said. "I have never seen him, nor any of Priam's family." "But you have heard things." Achilles was sitting forward now himself. "A little. I know more of his wife." "Anything," Achilles said. She nodded, cleared her throat softly as she often did before a story. "Her name is Andromache, and she is the only daughter of King Eetion of Cilicia. Hector is said to love her above all things. He first saw her when he came to her father's kingdom for tribute. She welcomed him and entertained him at the feast that evening. At the night's end, Hector asked her father for her hand." "She must have been very beautiful." "People say that she is fair, but not the fairest girl Hector might have found. She is known for sweet temper and gentle spirit. The country people love her because she often brings them food and clothes. She was pregnant, but I have not heard of what became of the child." "Where is Cilicia?" I asked. "It is to the south, along the coast, not far from here by horse." "Near Lesbos," Achilles said. Briseis nodded. Later, when all the rest had gone, he said, "We raided Cilicia. Did you know?" "No." He nodded. "I remember that man, Eetion. He had 8 sons. They tried to hold us off." I could tell by the quietness of his voice. "You killed them. An entire family slaughtered." He caught the look on my face, though I tried to hide it, but he did not lie to me, ever. "Yes." I knew he killed men every day. He came home wet with their blood, stains he scrubbed from his skin before dinner, but there were moments, like now, when that knowledge overwhelmed me. When I would think of all the tears that he had made fall, and all the years that had passed. And now, Andromache, too, and Hector grieved because of him. He seemed to sit across the world from me then, though he was so close I could feel the warmth rising from his skin. His hands were in his lap, spear callous but beautiful still. No hands had ever been so gentle, or so deadly. Overhead the stars were veiled. I could feel the air's heaviness. There would be a storm tonight. The rain would be soaking, filling up the earth till she burst her seams. It would gush down from the mountain tops, gathering strength to sweep away what stood in its path, animals and houses and men. "He is such a flood," I thought. His voice broke the silence of my thoughts. "I left one son alive," he said, "the 8th son, so that their line would not die." Strange that such a small kindness felt like grace, and yet, what other warrior would have done as much? Killing a whole family was something to boast of, a glorious deed that proved you powerful enough to wipe a name from the earth. This surviving son would have children. He would give them his family's name and tell their story. They would be preserved, in memory if not in life. "I am glad," I said, my heart full. The logs in the fire grew white with ash. "It is strange," he said. "I've always said that Hector's done nothing to offend me. But he cannot say the same, now." Chapter 24. Years passed, and a soldier, one of Ajax's, began to complain about the war's length. At first he was ignored. The man was hideously ugly and known to be a scoundrel. But he grew eloquent. 4 years, he said, and nothing to show for it. Where is the treasure? Where's the woman? When will we leave? Ajax clouded him on the head, but the man would not be silenced. "See how they treat us?" Slowly, his discontent spread from one camp to the next. It had been a bad season, particularly wet, and miserable for fighting. Injuries abounded, rashes and mud-turned ankles and infections. The biting flies had settled so thickly over parts of the camp, they looked like clouds of smoke. Sullen and scratching, men began to loiter around the agora. At first they did nothing but collect in small groups, whispering. Then the soldier who had begun it joined them, and their voices grew louder. 4 years! How do we know she's even in there? Has anyone seen her? Troy will never submit to us. We should all just stop fighting." When Agamemnon heard, he ordered them whipped. The next day there were twice as many. Not a few were Mycenaeans. Agamemnon sent an armed force to disperse them. The men slunk off, then returned when the force was gone. In answer, Agamemnon ordered a phalanx to guard the agora all day. But this was frustrating duty, in full sun, where the flies were most numerous. By the end of the day, the phalanx was ragged from desertion, and the number of mutineers had swollen. Agamemnon used spies to report on those who complained. These men were then seized and whipped. The next morning, several hundred men refused to fight. Some gave illness as an excuse. Some gave no excuse at all. Word spread, and now more men took suddenly ill. They threw their swords and shields onto the dais in a heap and blocked the agora. When Agamemnon tried to force his way through, they folded their arms and would not budge. Denied in his own agora, Agamemnon grew red in the face. Then redder. His fingers went white on the scepter he held, stout wood banded with iron. When the man in front of him spat at his feet, Agamemnon lifted the scepter and brought it down sharply on his head. We all heard the crack of breaking bone. The man dropped. I do not think Agamemnon meant to hit him so hard. He seemed frozen, staring at the body at his feet, unable to move. Another man knelt to roll the body over. Half the skull was caved in from the force of the blow. The news hissed through the men with a sound like fire lighting. Many drew their knives. I heard Achilles murmur something, then he was gone from my side. Agamemnon's face was filled with the growing realization of his mistake. He had recklessly left his loyal guards behind. He was surrounded now. Help could not reach him even if it wanted to. I held my breath, sure I was about to see him die. "Men of Greece!" Startled faces turned to the shout. Achilles stood atop a pile of shields on the dais. He looked every inch the champion, beautiful and strong, his face serious. "You're angry," he said. This caught their attention. They were angry. It was unusual for a general to admit that his troops might feel such a thing. "Speak your grievance," he said. "We want to leave." The voice came from the back of the crowd. "The war is hopeless. The general lied to us." A surging murmur of agreement. "It has been 4 years." This last was the angriest of all. I could not blame them. For me, these 4 years had been an abundance. Time that had been wrested from the hands of miserly fates. But for them, it was a life stolen, from children and wives, from family and home. "It is your right to question such things," Achilles said. "You feel misled. You were promised victory." "Yes!" I caught a glimpse of Agamemnon's face, curdled with anger. But he was stuck in the crowd, unable to free himself or speak without causing a scene. "Tell me," Achilles said, "do you think Aristos Achaeon fights in hopeless wars?" The men did not answer. "Well?" "No," someone said. Achilles nodded gravely. "No, I do not, and I will swear, on my oath, I am here because I believe that we will win. I'm staying until the end." "That is fine for you," a different voice. "But what of those who wish to go?" Agamemnon opened his mouth to answer. I could imagine what he might have said. No one leaves, deserters will be executed, but he was lucky that Achilles was swifter. "You're welcome to leave whenever you like." "We are?" The voice was dubious. "Of course." He paused and offered his most guileless, friendly smile. "But I get your share of the treasure when we take Troy." I felt the tension in the air ease, heard a few huffs of appreciative laughter. The Prince Achilles spoke of treasure to be won, and where there was greed, there was hope. Achilles saw the change in them. He said, "It is past time to take the field. The Trojans will start to think we are afraid." He drew his flashing sword and held it in the air. "Who dares to show them otherwise?" There were shouts of agreement, followed by a general clanging as the men reclaimed their armor, seized their spears. They hoisted the dead man and carried him off. Everyone agreed that he had always been troublesome. Achilles leapt down from the dais and passed Agamemnon with a formal nod. The king of Mycenae said nothing, but I watched his eyes follow Achilles for a long time after that. In the aftermath of the almost rebellion, Odysseus devised a project to keep the men too busy for further unrest. A giant palisade, built around the entire camp. 10 miles he wanted it to run, protecting our tents and our ships from the plain beyond. At its base would be a ditch, bristling with spikes. When Agamemnon announced the project, I was sure the men would know it for the ploy it was. In all the years of the war, the camp and ships had never been in danger. Whatever reinforcements came, after all, who could get past Achilles? But then Diomedes stepped forward, praising the plan and frightening the men with visions of night raids and burning ships. This last part was particularly effective. Without the ships, we could not get home again. By the end of it, the men's eyes were bright and eager, as they went cheerfully off to the woods with their hatchets and levels. Odysseus found the original trouble-causing soldier. Thetis, his name was, and had him beaten quietly into unconsciousness. That was the end of mutinies at Troy. Things changed after that, whether because of the joint venture of the wall or the relief of violence averted. All of us, from the lowest foot soldier to the general himself, began to think of Troy as a sort of home. Our invasion became an occupation. Before now, we had lived as scavengers off the land and the villages we raided. Now we began to build, not just the wall, but the things of a town, a forge and a pen for the cattle we stole from the neighboring farms, even a potter's shed. In this last, amateur artisans labored to replace the cracking ceramics we had brought with us, most of them leaking or broken from hard camp use. Everything we own now was makeshift, scrounged, having lived at least 2 lives before as something else. Only the king's personal armors remained untouched, insignias polished and pure. The men, too, became less like dozens of different armies and more like countrymen. These men, who had left Aulis as Cretans and Cypriots and Argives, were now simply Greeks, cast into the same pot by the otherness of the Trojans, sharing food and women and clothing and battle stories, their distinctions blurred away. Agamemnon's boast of uniting Greece was not so idle after all. Even years later, this camaraderie would remain, a fellow feeling so uncharacteristic of our fiercely warring kingdoms. For a generation there would be no wars among those of us who had fought at Troy. Even I was not exempt. During this time, 6-7 years in which I spent more and more hours in Machaon's tent and fewer with Achilles in the field, I got to know the other men well. Everyone eventually made their way there, if only for smashed toes or ingrown nails. Even Automedon came, covering the bleeding remnants of a savage spoil with his hand. Men doted on their slave women and brought them to us with swollen bellies. We delivered their children in a steady, squalling stream, then fixed their hurts as they grew older. And it was not just the common soldiery. In time, I came to know the kings as well. Nestor with his throat syrup, honeyed and warmed, that he wanted at the end of a day. Menelaus and the opiate he took for his headaches. Ajax's acid stomach. It moved me to see how much they trusted me, turned hopeful faces towards me for comfort. I grew to like them, no matter how difficult they were in council. I developed a reputation, a standing in the camp. I was asked for, known for my quick hands and how little pain I caused. Less and less often, Podalirius took his turn in the tent. I was the one who was there when Machaon was not. I began to surprise Achilles, calling out to these men as we walked through the camp. I was always gratified at how they would raise a hand in return, point to the scar that had healed over well. After they were gone, Achilles would shake his head. "I don't know how you remember them all. I swear, they look the same to me." I would laugh and point them out again. "That's Athenius, Diomedes' charioteer, and that's Patroclus, whose brother was the first to die, remember?" "There are too many of them," he said. "It's simpler if they just remember me." The faces around our hearth began to dwindle, as one woman after another quietly took a Myrmidon for her lover, and then husband. They no longer needed our fire. They had their own. We were glad. Laughter in the camp and voices raised in pleasure at night, and even the swelling of bellies. Myrmidons grinning with satisfaction were things that were welcomed, the golden stitch of their happiness like a fretted border around our own. After a time, only Briseis was left. She never took a lover, despite her beauty and the many Myrmidons who pursued her. Instead, she grew into a kind of aunt, a woman with sweets and love potions and soft fabrics for the drying of eyes. This is how I think of us when I remember our nights at Troy. Achilles and I beside each other, and Phoenix smiling, and Automedon stuttering through the punchlines of jokes, and Briseis, with her secret eyes and quick, spilling laughter. I woke before dawn and felt the first twinging cold of fall in the air. It was a festival day, the harvest of first fruits to the god Apollo. Achilles was warm beside me, his naked body heavy with sleep. The tent was very dark, but I could just see the features of his face, the strong jaw and gentle curves of his eyes. I wanted to wake him and see those eyes open. 1,000 times I had seen it, but I never tired of it. My hand slid lightly over his chest, stroking the muscles beneath. We were both of us strong now, from days in the white tent and in the field. It shocked me sometimes to catch sight of myself. I looked like a man, broad as my father had been, though much leaner. He shivered beneath my hand, and I felt desire rise in me. I drew back the covers so that I might see all of him. I bent and pressed my mouth to him, in soft kisses that trailed down his stomach. Dawn stole through the tent flap. The room lightened. I saw the moment he woke and knew me. Our limbs slid against one another, on paths that we had traced so many times before, yet still were not old. Some time later, we rose and took our breakfast. We had thrown open the tent flap to let in the air. It ruffled pleasantly over our damp skin. Through the doorway we watched the crisscrossing of Myrmidons about their chores. We saw Automedon race down to the sea for a swim. We saw the sea itself, inviting and warm from a summer of sun. My hand sat familiarly on his knee. She did not come through the door. She was simply there, in the tent center, where a moment before there had been empty space. I gasped and yanked my hand from where it rested on him. I knew it was foolish, even as I did it. She was a goddess. She could see us whenever she wished. "Mother," he said in greeting. "I have received a warning." The words were snapped off, like an owl biting through a bone. The tent was dim, but Thetis' skin burned cold and bright. I could see each slicing line of her face, each fold of her shimmering robe. It had been a long time since I had seen her so close, since Syros. I had changed since then. I had gained strength and size, and a beard that grew if I did not shave it away. But she was the same. Of course she was.
"Apollo is angry and looks for ways to move against the Greeks. You will sacrifice to him today."
"I will," Achilles said. "We always observe the festivals dutifully, slitting the throats and roasting the fat."
"You must,"
she said. Her eyes were fixed on Achilles. They did not seem to see me at all.
"A hecatomb."
Our grandest offering, 100 head of sheep or cattle. Only the richest and most powerful men could afford such an extravagance of piety.
"Whatever the others do, do this. The gods have chosen sides, and you must not draw their anger."
It would take us most of the day to slaughter them all, and the camp would smell like a charnel house for a week. But Achilles nodded. "We will do it," he promised. Her lips were pressed together, 2 red slashes like the edge of a wound.
"There is more,"
she said. Even without her gaze upon me, she frightened me. She brought the whole urgent universe wherever she went, portents and angry deities and 1,000 looming perils. "What is it?" She hesitated, and fear knotted in my throat. What could make a goddess pause was terrifying indeed.
"A prophecy,"
she said,
"that the best of the Myrmidons will die before 2 more years have passed."
Achilles' face was still, utterly still. "We have known it was coming," he said, a curt shake of her head.
"No, the prophecy says you will still be alive when it happens."
Achilles frowned. "What do you think it means?"
"I do not know,"
she said. Her eyes were very large. The black pools opened as if they would drink him, pull him back into her.
"I fear a trick."
The fates were well known for such riddles, unclear until the final piece had fallen, then bitterly clear.
"Be watchful,"
she said.
You must take care.
I will, he said. She had not seemed to know I was there, but now her eyes found me, and her nose wrinkled as if at a rising stench. She looked back to him.
He is not worthy of you,
she said.
He has never been.
We disagree on this, Achilles answered. He said it as if he had said it many times before. Probably he had. She made a low noise of contempt, then vanished. Achilles turned to me. She is afraid. I know, I said. I cleared my throat, trying to release the clot of dread that had formed there. Who is the best of the Myrmidons, do you think, if I am excluded? I cast my mind through our captains. I thought of Automedon, who had become Achilles' valuable second on the battlefield, but I would not call him best. I don't know, I said. Do you think it means my father? He asked. Peleus, home in Phthia, who had fought with Heracles and Perseus, a legend in his own time for piety and courage, even if not in times to come. Maybe, I admitted. We were silent a moment. Then he said, I suppose we will know soon enough. It is not you, I said. At least there is that. That afternoon we performed the sacrifice his mother had commanded. The Myrmidons built the altar fires high, and I held bowls for the blood while Achilles cut throat after throat. We burned the rich thigh pieces with barley and pomegranate, poured our best wine over the coals. Apollo is hungry, she had said, one of our most powerful gods with his arrows that could stop a man's heart. Swift as rays of sun. I was not known for my piety, but that day I praised Apollo with an intensity that could have rivaled Peleus himself. And whoever the best of the Myrmidons was, I sent the gods a prayer for him as well. Briseis asked me to teach her medicine and promised in return a knowledge of the area's herbs, indispensable to Machaon's dwindling supply. I agreed, and passed my contented days with her in a forest, parting low-hanging branches, reaching underneath rotting logs for mushrooms as delicate and soft as the ear of a baby. Sometimes on those days her hand would accidentally brush mine, and she would look up and smile, water drops hanging from her ears and hair like pearls. Her long skirt was tied practically around her knees, revealing feet that were sturdy and sure. One of these days we had stopped for lunch. We feasted on cloth-wrapped bread and cheese, strips of dried meat, and water scooped with our hands from the stream. It was spring, and we were surrounded by the profusion of Anatolian fertility. For 3 weeks the earth would paint herself in every color, burst every bud, unfurl each rioting petal. Then, the wild flush of her excitement spent, she would settle down to the steady work of summer. It was my favorite time of the year. I should have seen it coming. Perhaps you will think me stupid that I did not. I was telling her a story, something about Chiron, I think, and she was listening, her eyes dark like the earth on which we sat. I finished, and she was quiet. This was nothing unusual. She was often quiet. We were sitting close to each other, heads together as if in conspiracy. I could smell the fruit she had eaten. I could smell the rose oil she pressed for the other girls, still staining her fingers. She was so dear to me, I thought. Her serious face and clever eyes. I imagined her as a girl, scraped with tree climbing, skinny limbs flying as she ran. I wished that I had known her then, that she had been with me at my father's house, had skipped stones with my mother. Almost I could imagine her there, hovering just at the edge of my remembrance. Her lips touched mine. I was so surprised I did not move. Her mouth was soft and a little hesitant. Her eyes were sweetly closed. Of habit, of its own accord, my mouth parted. A moment passed like this, the ground beneath us, the breeze sifting flower scents. Then she drew back, eyes down, waiting for judgment. My pulse sounded in my ears, but it was not as Achilles made it sound. It was something more like surprise, and fear that I would hurt her. I put my hands to hers. She knew then. She felt in the way that I took her hand, the way my gaze rested on her. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I shook my head, but could not think of what more to say. Her shoulders crept up like folded wings. "I know that you love him," she said, hesitating a little before each word. "I know, but I thought that some men have wives and lovers both. Her face looked very small and so sad that I could not be silent. Briseis, I said, if I ever wish to take a wife, it would be you. But you do not wish to take a wife. No, I said as gently as I could. She nodded and her eyes dropped again. I could hear her slow breaths, the faint tremor in her chest. I'm sorry, I said. Do you not ever want children? She asked. The question surprised me. I still felt half a child myself, though most my age were parents several times over. I don't think I would be much of a parent, I said. I do not believe that, she said. I don't know, I said. Do you? I asked it casually, but it seemed to strike deep, and she hesitated. Maybe, she said. And then I understood, too late, what she had really been asking me. I flushed, embarrassed at my thoughtlessness, and humbled too. I opened my mouth to say something, to thank her perhaps, but she was already standing, brushing off her dress. Shall we go? There was nothing to do but rise and join her. That night, I could not stop thinking of it. Briseis and my child. I saw stumbling legs and dark hair and the mother's big eyes. I saw us by the fire, Briseis and I, and the baby, playing with some bit of wood I had carved. Yet there was an emptiness to the scene, an ache of absence. Where was Achilles? Dead? Or had he never existed? I could not live in such a life. But Briseis had not asked me to. She had offered me all of it, herself, and the child, and Achilles too. I shifted to face Achilles. Do you ever think of having children? I asked. His eyes were closed, but he was not sleeping. I have a child, he answered. It shocked me anew each time I remembered it. His child, with Didymia. A boy, Thetis had told him, called Neoptolemus. New war, nicknamed Phthia, for his fiery red hair. It disturbed me to think of him, a piece of Achilles wandering through this world. Does he look like you? I had asked Achilles once. Achilles had shrugged. I didn't ask. Do you wish you could see him? Achilles shook his head. It is best that my mother raise him. He will be better with her. I did not agree, but this was not the time to say so. I waited a moment for him to ask me if I wished to have a child, but he did not, and his breathing grew more even. He always fell asleep before I did. Achilles? Do you like Briseis? He frowned, his eyes still closed. Like her? Enjoy her, I said, you know. His eyes opened, more alert than I had expected. What does this have to do with children? Nothing, but I was obviously lying. Does she wish to have a child? Maybe, I said. With me? He said. No, I said. That is good, he said, eyelids drooping once more. Moments passed and I was sure he was asleep, but then he said, with you. She wants to have a child with you. My silence was his answer. He sat up, the blanket falling from his chest. Is she pregnant? He asked. There was a tautness to his voice I had not heard before. No, I said. His eyes dug into mine, sifting them for answers. Do you want to? He asked. I saw the struggle on his face. Jealousy was strange to him, a foreign thing. He was hurt, but did not know how to speak of it. I felt cruel suddenly for bringing it up. No, I said. I do not think so, no. If you wanted it, it would be all right. Each word was carefully placed. He was trying to be fair. I thought of the dark-haired child again. I thought of Achilles. It is all right now, I said. The relief on his face filled me with sweetness. Things were strange for some time after that. Briseis would have avoided me, but I called on her as I used to, and we went for our walks as we always had. We talked of camp gossip and medicine. She did not mention wives, and I was careful not to mention children. I still saw the softness in her eyes when she looked at me. I did my best to return it, as I could.